This is Lost History of Eden. I'm Toby Vance. This is my new YouTube channel. I got a lot of stuff coming. This is kind of my introductory video that's going to kind of introduce you to a lot of my ideas and to many of the things we're going to be discussing and talking about on my upcoming videos. There's a lot to cover, got lots of information I want to put out. But this video will kind of lay the groundwork for where I'm coming from the different points of view that we'll be discussing and giving you some familiarity with them so that you understand what I'm talking about when I make reference to some of these viewpoints. But basically, I have my own sort of paradigm that I'm coming from, and I want you to understand what that is before we jump off into the informational videos on all of the different aspects of archaeology and history and the Bible and things we're going to be discussing. So we'll talk about that first here in this video. In the approach to sort of merging science and the Bible together, there's been lots of ways in which that has been done. And when I talk about the Bible here, I just want to make clear what we're going to be concentrating on primarily will be what is referred to as the Old Testament of the Bible. I myself am Jewish, so we refer to it as the Tanakh in Christianity, and for probably the majority of people know it as the Old Testament. And mostly we're going to be focusing on the earliest books of the Tanakh of the Old Testament. Genesis, Exodus, maybe getting into some of the historical books and the prophets, but by and large, most of what we will be concentrating on will be in Genesis and Exodus and possibly Joshua. Most of the data and the stories and so on that we're looking at is early human history, which is why we're concentrating on the earliest parts of the Bible. I believe the Bible has a very accurate representation of how humankind came about and sort of the background of our history. But I don't believe that people interpret it correctly. I believe there's a lot of ideas out there, and many of them are wrong, and many of them are flawed. So we're going to approach this kind of from a different perspective. Now, the perspective I take is not one that's entirely new. There are people out there that kind of hold to the same views I do, and I'll talk about that. But it is sort of a minority view. It's not one that's really prominent. Really, when we talk about ways of merging and converging the Bible and science, there's usually three predominant approaches that are taken. And the approach that I take kind of falls out of all of those three, although it draws off of all of three of them to some degree. And you'll see that as we go into more detail in later videos. The first perspective, really, in merging together the Bible and science and history and archaeology would be what we call the biblical critical view. It's a view that started sort of coming to prominence back in the 1800s. There was a lot of archaeology going on, particularly in the Middle East and in the land of Israel, which would have been Palestine at that time. During that period of time, there was a lot of exploration and digging to find many of the things that the Bible talked about. As we moved towards the end of the 1800s and into the early 1900s and the early 20th century, there was a lot of focus on trying to find evidence for these things, and a lot of it was not being found. Now, we're going to talk later about why that is, because I do believe that if we look in the right place, we'll find evidence for much of what's in the early stories of the Bible. I think due to that fact and due to sort of some tunnel vision, some stove piping, a lot of stuff is not being found that fits with the Bible. And due to that, there began to be a lot of cynicism and skepticism towards the Bible being accurate in any way. And this led to this biblical critical approach, which you have coming from many of the archaeologists who do biblical archaeology, men like William Deaver, Israel Finkelstein, and others who begin to doubt the accuracy of the Bible historically, archaeologically, scientifically. And so we get this critical approach to the Bible. So in this view, biblical stories, particularly the early stories in Genesis and Exodus, are mythical. They're allegories. There's no factual basis to them, no historical basis to them. And so they sort of reach this point where there's not much more we're going to do in terms of looking for these things in the archaeological record because we don't think they're there. The biblical critical approach, they're also called minimalist because they see very little in the Bible that can be utilized for historical and archaeological purposes. The biblical minimalists believe that there's probably some nuggets and kernels of truth in some of the biblical stories, and so they will look and try and find some of those things and expand on those and say, well, this, looks like this could be sort of the basis for what was told in the Bible, only it's just been exaggerated and kind of, blown out of proportion. So that's kind of the way that they see things. A good quote would be from Israel Finkelstein, one of the biblical critics, who's very prominent in biblical archaeology, very well known, renowned Israeli archaeologist, who said, "It is now evident that many events of biblical history did not take place in either the particular era or the manner described. Some of the most famous events in the Bible clearly never happened at all." So that's a very good summation of the viewpoint from the biblical minimalist. These are just mythical stories. There's not a lot of historical basis to them. So it's kind of pointless in trying to even look anymore for these things because we're pretty sure they're not historical. And so you're not likely to find anything that fits with them from the archaeological record or from the historical record. You may find, things here and there that are kind of a historical basis for some of those stories, but they're going to be things that are going to be highly exaggerated and so on. So that's really the biblical critical approach. That's one end of the spectrum. Really what I would call the other end of the spectrum would be the literal approach to the Bible, sort of what we see in biblical fundamentalists, those who take the Bible literally and everything it says, every story it tells is fact for fact true, and that there is nothing in there that is exaggerated, overblown, or a lie in any way, shape, or form. That viewpoint sees the stories in the Bible as happening exactly as they were written. They take all of the stories literally. And when they take the science and the scientific data, then what they do is they tend to take that data and pigeonhole it into their view of what they think these literal Bible stories are saying. It's because of this that you'll see, particularly in what we call young earth creationism, okay, which is a view that's pretty particular to fundamentalist Christians, evangelical Christians, where they believe that the earth is only 6,000 years old. They take the timelines in the Bible literally, so they believe that creation happened 6,000 years ago. God created everything, the whole universe, 6,000 years ago. Adam and Eve were created right at the beginning, and they lived in the garden, tempted by the serpent. And then from there, you get the stories going up until Noah and the flood. They believe dinosaurs existed prior to Noah. They believe Noah took dinosaurs on the ark. They believe everything we see in the geological record, all those layers, came from the worldwide flood. They don't believe they took billions of years. So they take scientific data, but they grossly misinterpret it in a way to fit it into their viewpoint. So that would be kind of another extreme. I think here you've got a quote here from a young earth creationist, really the founder of that movement, Dr. Henry Morris. And he says, when science and the Bible differ, science has obviously misinterpreted its data. So that's a very good summation of their viewpoint. Anything that differs in any way from the literal reading of the Bible must be wrong in its interpretation as far as archaeology and science goes. So that's kind of the other end. So those are our two extreme views. I believe that the truth is to be found somewhere in that middle territory. And I think we can find that in a way that does justice to both sides. Now, there are some other sort of perspectives that also fall kind of in that middle category. So we'll cover one other before we look at the viewpoint that I take. And that is what's called old earth creationism or theistic evolution. Okay, this is a position where you get those they're typically scientists, or they are very have a very high view of science, but they also are adherents to particularly Christianity is where you see this. They're very religious. Their view is that we can maintain the science and we can maintain the Bible if we just kind of reinterpret the Bible a little ways, is typically what they do. So they hold on to the science pretty much as it's presented in mainstream science, maybe with some minor variations, especially with old earth creationism. They still believe God instantaneously created humans. They don't believe in evolution, but they believe that creation occurred over billions of years. God created various species at various points in time throughout the 4.5 billion year history of the earth. Old earth theistic evolutionists believe that God used evolution to bring about humans. They still believe God was behind the process. And here's a quote from Hugh Ross, who is an astronomer and holds to this old earth creationist perspective. He says the Bible gives a true and trustworthy account of creation, and that account in no way conflicts with or contradicts an old earth view, and vice versa. Fundamentalist Christians, adhering to what is termed creation science, loudly promote the scientific accuracy of the Bible, but they sift or reinterpret science through the tiny mesh of their ideological filter. Not much real science gets through, okay? So you can see here they believe the science is pretty accurate with some minor variations, and they believe they can take much of what's in the Bible and kind of reinterpret it to fit into that science. My view, while sort of taking some of the ideas that come from this perspective, is a viewpoint that kind of draws off of all three of these. Okay. I believe that when we look at these different perspectives, we'll see that there's some truth elements to all of them. And then there are some errors in all of them. So you'll see that the point of view that I adhere to is a point of view that kind of draws elements from all three of these and tries to bring them together in something that's even more coherent. My viewpoint is a viewpoint that I call the alternate interpretive synthesis. And that's because from the viewpoint that I hold to, I believe that on the scientific side, there's some anomalous alternative data out there, but it's not accepted by science, and it's rarely looked at or even reviewed in any way because of a particular paradigm that science holds to. On the same front, on the other side with the Bible, you have those who hold to the Bible have their own particular interpretation of things that are in the Bible, and there are sort of some anomalous things and some anomalous interpretations of those things in the Bible that aren't held by the mainstream. So on both sides, you can have these anomalous kind of data that's kind of rejected by the majority on both sides. And in that anomalous data, I believe is where the truth is to be found. And I believe taking that anomalous data and kind of merging it together, we get a picture that is much more accurate in terms of human history and the history of our planet, which fits with, for the most part, science and the Bible. So that, I believe, is where the truth is to be found, in that anomalous field of data, which is why I call it the alternate interpretive synthesis, okay? Those alternative interpretations of data within science and the Bible, we take those and we kind of synthesize those together, and we get a really clear picture, I think, of what's going on and what happened in Earth history. So it's a merging of all of this alternative anomalous data and bringing it in so we get a better sense of what's going on. Probably a good representative of this viewpoint that I hold to, although those that adhere to this viewpoint have our own variations and differences. Those who fall under the alternative archaeology and history banner don't all agree on everything. But I think probably a very good representative of this position would be Graham Hancock. A quote from him, he says, "Human history has become too much a matter of dogma taught by professionals in ivory towers as though it's all fact. Actually, much of human history is up for grabs. The further back you go, the more that the history that's taught in the schools and universities begins to look like some kind of fairy story." So that's a good foundation for where I'm coming from, okay? Very good summation of kind of the philosophical viewpoint that we take going into this view. There's a lot that science is very dogmatic about, which it really doesn't have a lot of basis to be dogmatic about. Some of these ideas and theories have been built up over time, and now scientists just hold to them because they're kind of the tradition. And so when data comes along that's anomalous and doesn't fit in, it just kind of gets swept under the rug. You see that happen quite a bit in science. Basically, this approach is an approach that, from mainstream science view, is seen as pseudo-scientific, okay? So it's typically and regularly called pseudoscience by those in mainstream science, which is to be expected to some degree. But this approach does accept a large amount of science. My approach accepts that the Earth is 4.5 billion years old. The universe is 14 to 15 billion years old. There was some form of a Big Bang at the beginning of the universe. What that entailed, I'm not sure. And I think there's still a lot of variability in exactly what happened in the inflationary period of the early part of the universe. I believe also evolution happened, but I believe that there's a lot that went on aside from those things. That was a process that was being guided by a higher intelligence, a higher consciousness, ultimately the highest consciousness, what we would call God. And so I think there's a lot of data there to show that that's the case. And so in our future videos and in our video series here on this channel, those are the things we're going to be looking into. We're going to be looking at a lot of this data, drawing it in, talking about how it fits and how it makes much more sense of our history. There's a lot that goes on in science in terms of interpreting what they find, and I think it causes them to overlook things that are out there, which when we take those things and interpret them and put them into the timeline, we start to see that science is overlooking things because they're kind of sweeping things that don't make sense under the rug. And in doing that, they've started leaving some sort of gaping holes in their viewpoint. And many things in those holes don't make sense. Once we start taking some of this anomalous data into account, we start making sense of some of the history that right now seems kind of confusing and doesn't seem to fit with a lot of the things we know. There's a lot of data that has been ignored by scientists, and that is going to be the biggest concentration of the things we're going to be looking at on this channel. Things like multiple accounts of giant skeletons found throughout North America throughout the 18th, 19th, and early 20th centuries. Many cases, skeletons were dug up. Many cases, they were sent places. There's even reports of them being sent to the Smithsonian. So there seems to be, to some degree, some elements of science just kind of covering some of this stuff up because it doesn't make sense. It doesn't fit into the standard view of human history. And so that's the kind of things we'll be looking at. Things like multiple human artifacts that are found in the wrong geological layers, in layers that are millions of years old. Things like massive building endeavors, like Göbekli Tepe, Derinkuyu in Turkey, both of those in Turkey. These mounds that have been found in North America that were built by what are called the mound builders. There's all of these massive building projects which seem to have more of a history to them than what is being told by archaeology, and don't seem to fit correctly within the timeline of the standard view of human history. We have alternate historical artifacts like the Piri-Reis map, like the Hebrew stones that have been found in North America. Native American pictographs of what look like alien graves. Okay, things like that standard science tends to just write off or give some cursory explanation as to what they are, but without any evidence whatsoever to back it up, and then that's just accepted. So those are the things that we're going to be examining. We're going to be looking at that, piecing those things together, and what we're going to find is that what emerges is a really interesting picture of human history, and it's a picture that begins to line up with the things we read in the Bible. And so we're going to be discussing all of those things, the stories in the Bible that also have been sort of glossed over, the things like the Watchers, the B'nai Elohim. Who are these being referred to? The Nephilim. All of these various groups that are described as kind of almost supernatural types of beings, beings that clearly are not human, multiple species that are talked about. Where do they play a role in human history? And if they do, there should be some evidence, and I believe it's there. I believe it's being ignored by the scientific community. So we're going to look at those things. That's what this channel is all about. We're going to dig and find all of this anomalous data, historical data, archaeological data, scientific data. We're going to draw that out into the light so we can examine it and look at it and see where it fits in human history and see where it fits in the timeline of history as it plays out, not only in the historical record, but also in the Bible. So come join us, hit that subscribe button because we're going to have a lot of videos on the way, and it's going to start coming fast and furious. So I want everybody to get on board so you can see this stuff. I'll have lots of videos with pictures of evidence and things that we find. So it's going to be exciting stuff. So I hope everybody joins us. And as I said, hit the subscribe button because you don't want to miss it. Thanks a lot.